Hi, how you doing? It's week 3 already. Gosh, these weeks go so fast. At least I experience them in online courses going so fast. So anyway, if that's happening to you, hopefully that's a good thing. If that's happening and it's a bad thing, well, anyway, just try your best to keep up and never hesitate to get in touch with me if you have any problems or whatever. But for this week then, week 3, there's 3 texts there. And do note, so the third one from Mohanty, I say a few things there on Blackboard. But also, basically, if you're really pressed for time, you can put that off for later. You can consider that, at least for now, kind of optional. If you do have time, have a look. It's a bit on the long side, but the main points are hopefully made fairly clear, and I probably try to bring them out in those notes. But anyway, if you're pressed for time, just read the Lloyd and the Bordo, basically. So concerning those, they're saying something similar in a way. Bordo just goes a little further or is doing something just slightly different. But they're both concerned basically to try to say something about the kind of bias, I'll always say like masculinist bias, that is present in philosophy. It's present elsewhere too. Don't worry, it's not just philosophy, but that's what we're focusing on here. And they both want to make clear that this is not simply a matter of the fact that, say, historically, virtually every philosopher until relatively recently was indeed a man, typically white privileged men. They say that that's not necessarily a good thing, of course, but that's itself not the problem. It's not as if there's some sort of conspiracy. One of the two uses that word somewhere. It's not like that. They try to dig deeper. Right, and they try to say, well, there's something, deeper about the very structure of kind of thought that we have in philosophy, which often spreads from philosophy to other areas, right? This sense of thinking in terms of hierarchical binaries, right? That's kind of the key thing, basically, that lots of concepts and ideas that are very, very important to us don't come, by themselves, say, or they're not just pure concepts, but they're often part of a binary package. They refer to something else. Mind refers to body. There's a binary that goes together. Culture refers to nature. Right? Reason refers to emotion. Active refers to passive, and so on. These kind of complementary things where one term is always understood as having a greater value, being more important, and is implicitly contrasted with its other, the other side of things, kind of the opposite. They go together, like men and women in a certain sense, I suppose, in human history. But they're understood to be different in terms of their value and their significance and so on. So that's the claim they're both basically making, sometimes drawing on other sources. But that's sort of the problem. The bias that we're really sure is there in philosophy historically needs to be located at that level, quite deep in terms of the structure of our thought. And that's what we need to think about if we want to overcome that kind of bias. Bordo, you'll see, is doing something a little bit different in the sense that she might think that. She's also replying to some people who were critical of that view, thinking that perhaps it was simplistic. Partly noting, rightly so, that gender oppression is not the only problem in the world, that this is often bound up and mixed up with other forms of oppression, perhaps along lines of race, for example. And that is not so simple, simply to speak about what they were calling the maleness or simply a masculinist bias. And Bordo says, well, that's fine. That's definitely true. But we would still lose something important if we cease to speak about this kind of problem in this way. That these terms, as she puts them, the binaries, the concepts that are so central, are gender-coded. They are other things too. There are other problems, and these are complicated, of course. But we do need to hold on to that view, that there is this kind of male or whatever masculinist bias in philosophy. It makes sense to see it that way. We would lose sight of a whole lot of important things if we just got rid of that, as some of those critics were suggesting. So that's kind of what they're basically both up to. The upshot for each, I think, is to say that it's a lot of work, but their possibility of really doing feminist philosophy is a real one. Philosophy is not irredeemably compromised by this kind of bias. It's a historical fact. But at the same time, hopefully, owing to its nature as a kind of critical thought, philosophy should be able to overcome these things. It should, as long as we try to push it and take it in the right direction. So that's not going to happen automatically, but hopefully, if there's enough people convinced that this is indeed a problem, that it's possible to solve, and it's something we would like to solve, then we might be able to do it and actually work out a more feminist kind of philosophy, which would be, overall a better kind of philosophical approach. Quickly, I'll just say something about the Mohanty piece. If you do have a look at it, the reason I've included it here at this point is just to show something that kind of works both ways, or two different ways. On the one hand, it's a strong critique of feminism as it had been developed up to that point in the 1980s. A critique of feminism basically for reproducing the same sort of problem that it was so critical of in others. Basically, so with regard to non-Western women, the same sort of metaphysical structure was imposed, the same sort of self, other, a hierarchical binary was used, and it had sort of not very good results in terms of downplaying the actual concrete realities of non-Western women. On the other hand, though, it does sort of reinforce the feminist, the critique from others, whether it's Lloyd or Bordo or whoever, in terms of identifying what the problems are, because in a way it's not to be wondered at if it's true that those sort of binary structures of thought are real and they're there and they're deep. It's not surprising that they might just get reproduced. One has to be very careful. Sometimes these things can operate without our conscious intention. They typically do, in fact. So we do have to be vigilant and be on our guard, and there may be other such cases, even now today, there may be others, and there may continue to be revealed, where that same kind of pattern might reproduce itself. In itself, that's not a problem. I mean, what would be a problem is to have that brought to your attention and not to care, or not to try to take any steps to deal with it. That would be perhaps the worst thing. But hopefully that wouldn't be the case should that ever, when other similar cases are brought to light. And anyway, that was the point of having the Mohanty, if you do look at it now, but at least focus on the other two, Lloyd and Bordo. They are, maybe a little more abstract in some ways. So as I noted on Blackboard, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to discussion particularly well. It can, but anyways. So I've suggested we try to think about them just in a more concrete way. I've suggested in terms of fashion. You'll see what I mean. But try to think about them in those ways, or if you have any other examples, be thinking about those and you can bring them out. And yeah, anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. But let me know if you have any questions or problems or whatever.